So today we're going to go over a Stack Overflow question and see if we found a solution for it. We picked one that seems to apply to both of us because we like to get our hands dirty in the front end. So this question is basically to create a JS carousel to transition between slides. He's got most of the CSS here, most of the HTML. He just needed some JavaScript and a few transitions. He specifically said that he wanted smooth transitions. So that was one of the things that we need to make sure to add into this. We don't just want a jarring flipping between slides. So instead of having everybody watch us go through our process, which would be very boring and long and irritating, we've actually already made the solution. So as you can see here, we've mostly just copied and pasted his CSS and HTML into an HTML scaffold. And then we also have our JavaScript here. So first, let's go through our JavaScript. We outlined what we needed to do, right? First, we need to get a list of all the slides that are the children of the wrapper. We don't want every slide class that's on the page. We may have multiple wrappers in the future.
Yeah, especially if you want to change something later, like if you want to add an arrow, a left or right arrow, or a pause button or something, and you decide you want to throw that into that same element, you want to make sure that you're targeting specific elements for ones that you want to be counted as slides.
Then we needed to have various CSS classes. So we needed an initial state for the slides. In this case, they need to be off screen to the right because we decided on a transition that will slide in from right to left, kind of like you're usually used to with a carousel. So we need to have them off screen to the right to start with. Then the current slide, we need to have shown in the middle. And then we need a third transition so that we can slide that current slide off to the left.
Because if you want to transition between two states of an element, what you need essentially for the browsers to render that is a comparison between the two. So for instance, if you want to fade in and out, you need to have a visible slide below and a slide that's appearing so you can fade the new one in, or vice versa, fade the old one out. You kind of can do either. Or if you want to slide between the two, you need to have something to compare them to. You can either you can do a few things. You can have one slide visible, slide a new one in over it, or have the new slide in and then have the old one slide out over top of it. So you need to be able to render a transition.
Right. So we needed those three states. Then we need to keep track of course, what is the current slide. So we need to keep track of an index in that array we have. Then finally, we need to go through our steps of adding and removing classes. So every 4 seconds, which was what the OP asked for, 4,000 milliseconds, we're going to remove the current class from the current slide and add our transition class. We're going to increment our index, and we'll get into some of the particulars about that one. And then we're going to add the current slide to the next current slide. So the JavaScript itself is actually pretty simple for something like this. First, of course, we're declaring our constants up here so that we can keep track of what the class names are. And then the first step, of course, was to get a list of the slides. In modern JavaScript, that's very easy. We just need to do a query selector all, dot wrapper, and then get all the children dot slide elements. we discussed we don't want all the slides, so we can't use get element by class name at this time because we need to get only the children of dot wrapper. Then we set our current slide index to 0. And you notice we're not adding that current class to the first slide here in JavaScript. And that's because it would give us kind of a flash of unstyled content if we had to wait for the JavaScript to load to get our current slide in there. Right. So we did that in the HTML instead.
Yeah, could you flip over to that?
Sure.
Yeah, so you have your markup there. If you were building this into a WordPress site or some other content management system or otherwise programmatically generating your markup, that could be something that you could have rendered with the page as soon as the browser loads it. That way you get that baseline state, styled state.
Exactly. Otherwise, you have no slide, and then all of a sudden, slide,
bam, it pops out.
Yeah, not the best transition there.
No.
So back to our JavaScript. So we have our list of slides, and we have our current slide index. Now, inside of our set interval, set to 4,000 milliseconds, we're going to do all of our work. Now, of course, if you were doing this in a real world project, you would probably want to keep track of the timer so that after 15 minutes or something, you could cancel it, because this does take CPU cycles and you don't want your users to, accidentally leave the page open and wonder why their computer is running slow. Right. So
the way that you would do that is you would assign it to a variable. And for instance, if you wanted to ever pause the state of the slider, like if someone hovered over the slider or hovered over the carousel, you could detect a hover state and then cancel the interval if you had a variable with that interval stored into it.
Right. Or if you added arrows in the future and you wanted to give custom control over the slides, then you could do it that way as well. You would want to cancel the timer, because otherwise they'd switch slides and then all of a sudden the slide would switch again. That would be weird. So then we're first starting by getting a mostly clean slate for our slides. And by that, I mean, we're removing that transition element from everything. Because with that transition element, we'll see later that the slide is going to be off to the left. Well, we want all the slides to be on the right so that they slide in correctly. So we remove that from all of the slides just to be safe. And then the next thing we do is we get our current slide using the index, and we add the transition class and remove the current class. This way it starts it sliding to the left. Then we find our next index. The naive way of doing this, which we may or may not have started with, is just current slide index plus plus. But when you get to the end of the array, for instance, this one has 3 slides in it. So we're at 0 for the first one, 1 at the second, 2 at the third slide. And then if we do current slide plus plus, then we're overrunning the array. We're not getting any elements and it fails. So we need to actually go back to 0 at that point to continually transition through the slides.
It's probably worth mentioning that there is an accepted answer on this article now, and what he uses is the remainder operator. But basically, you could use that as kind of a shortcut as an alternative to this method with this ternary operator for tracking your index. So that as long as you have your count of slides, use the remainder operator as long as the remainder was it like divisible by the number of slides for the current.
Yeah, we would do current slide index mod slides.length, and that would give us the remainder there would give us the actual index of the slide that we're currently on.
Right.
So that's a a great way to do it. And it does give you an advantage. You could actually find out, if you cared, how many rotations you've gone through on your slides. And that might be something that you use to, after 100 rotations, we want to cancel. So that would just be current slide index divided by slides.length. When it equals 100 or whatever, you cancel your timer. But in this case, we wanted to keep the slide index as the correct value. So that once we have the new slide index, then we find the slide that corresponds to that. So that would be the next current slide, and we add our current class. And that starts it sliding back in. Of course, you don't see any transitions here. That's because we don't use JavaScript transitions if we can at all avoid it. JavaScript animation can be very slow depending on the computer and very sketchy.
Dark alley sort of transitions.
Yes. It's just, you don't want to go down that alley. So instead, we use CSS transitions. And these can also be very blocky depending on what you're animating. So let's go through what we did, and then we'll just explain kind of why we transitioned on the element that we did, or on the property that we did. So first of all, we had to set some positions on our elements. We set position relative on the wrapper, and then position absolute down here on all the slides. That way we can easily position them and slide them throughout that wrapper. Once you do that, though, the wrapper is no longer getting its sizing from its children, because it doesn't take into consideration absolutely positioned children when determining its size. So we had to give the wrapper a height. We matched the height that was already given to each slide by the OP, which was full screen. And then we added overflow hidden so that we make sure that those slides aren't showing when they're supposed to be off screen. So then we have our initial state for the slides. So we already talked about absolute positioning. The width, I believe, was already on the OP's answer. All slides are 100% width of the wrapper, which made it easy to position them off screen. But we just do a left of 100% and they're off screen. You could pad this a little bit if you wanted to, just to make sure, but actually that might give you some issues because you might have a slight gap between the slides as they're sliding through. So 100% was a good number. And then we have our transition statement. So again, we could transition on left. We could set left at 0 on our current slide, and we could set left at -100 on -100% on our slide out, our transitionary class. But oftentimes that gets jaggy. The animation itself can be jaggy in some browsers. Transform, however, Transform X in particular on this one, is almost always very smooth. Gives you that nice frame rate. So that's what we use to slide our slides. And then finally, we have our Z index. This is very important because once the slide is off screen to the left and we remove that slide out, it's going to transition back to the right off screen. So if the slides have a higher Z index than the current slide, it's going to transition in front of the current slide. So we needed to make sure that those were further back in the stack. And it's important that you set it on the default value because we're actually removing the class, the transition class. So it's the initial Z index that matters in this case above all else. And then you'll see for the current slide, we have a translating X of -100%. It's already at 100%. So subtracting 100% brings us to 0 and right into the wrapper class. And then for the slide out, we have negative 200%. So it's 100%. It'll be an effective left value of negative 100%.
Nice. This is where if you want to be a front end developer, you get the most power by understanding CSS, the display of those elements, because you can swap elements in and out or change the position of them in JavaScript. But CSS actually, even though it's kind of confusing, it gives you a nice way to, if you're simply just styling your elements and swapping classes in and out, you can end up with a low amount of code, maintainable code, and it really helps you manage the display of your elements. So learning CSS and understanding how you can augment the display of different elements with different classes is a really good thing to understand.
And also, I would add to that, understanding when to use what, because there is a lot of times where you do want to use JavaScript to do things. And you could technically do it in CSS sometimes, but it's just better to do it in JavaScript.
Yeah.
So I think understanding how the two work together and how to when to use which of the tools in your toolbox is very important. So let's see how this works. So if I've already got a little HTTP server running with HTTP-server npm package. And if I switch to let's refresh so that we can see from beginning. So every 4 seconds, there's a nice slide transition from one slide to the next.
The victory.
So there you have it.
So we're going to throw this up on our GitHub. We'll enable GitHub pages in the repo too, so that if the OP wants to see a demo before he, decides if he wants to incorporate any of these things, then he's got a place to look at it. So, all right.